Someone asks you who you are, not your job, not your role, not your relationship to other people, who you actually are. And you find, somewhere in the pause before you answer, that you don't quite know. You know what you do. You know what people expect of you. You know the version of yourself you perform in different contexts. But the thing underneath all of that, the person who was there before the performing started, you're not sure. If this sounds familiar, you're not alone. And you're not broken. You're someone whose sense of self was interrupted, and who never received the conditions to finish building it. Here's the first unexpected fact. A stable sense of self is not something you are born with. It is something that develops through a specific set of experiences over a specific window of time with the help of specific conditions that not everyone receives. Developmental psychologist Erik Erikson identified identity formation as the central task of adolescence, the period during which a person experiments with different roles, values, and relationships to discover what feels genuinely their own. But identity development doesn't end at 18, and it can be significantly disrupted by environments that require too much performance, too much management of others, too little space to explore who you actually were. The person who doesn't know who they are didn't fail at identity. Their identity development was interrupted. Here's the most common reason. People who don't know who they are have almost always spent significant time being whoever was needed. The responsible one, the easy one, the capable one, the peacekeeper, the high achiever, the one who didn't cause problems. These roles were not chosen. They were adopted, often very early, often without conscious awareness, because they were the versions of the self that received love, approval, or safety. Psychologists call this adaptive self, a version of the self constructed not from genuine preferences and values, but from what the environment required. The adaptive self is functional, often highly functional, but it is built for survival, not for living. And the person who has spent years in it often experiences what psychologists call identity diffusion, a lack of clear, stable sense of who they are when the role is removed. Take away the job, the relationship, the function, and there is often a silence where a self should be. Here's the developmental layer. Finding out who you are requires a specific kind of space. Space to be inconsistent, to try something and abandon it, to like things and then not like them, to change your mind without consequence. Space to be curious about yourself, to follow an interest not because it's useful, but because it's interesting, to have opinions that aren't inherited, to ask what you actually want rather than what you're supposed to want. This space is not always available. In households that were demanding, unpredictable, or required constant management of adults, children often didn't have the psychological freedom to experiment with who they were. In academic or family environments where performance was the primary currency, there was rarely room for the kind of aimless exploration that identity requires. Psychologist James Marcia's research on identity statuses found that many adults remain in what he called identity foreclosure, having adopted an identity given to them by others without ever exploring alternatives. Not because they were lazy, because the space was never made available. Here's the layer that's hardest to see. When the space to build your own identity is limited, the space doesn't stay empty. It fills with what other people told you about who you are, with the roles they assigned you, with the reflections they offered, accurate or not. You're the smart one. You're the difficult one. You're the sensitive one. You're just like your father. You'll never be as good as your sister. These descriptions, absorbed young enough, become structure. They don't feel like other people's opinions. They feel like facts. Psychologists call this introjected identity, the self that is built not from inside out, but from outside in, from the descriptions and expectations of others that were absorbed before the person had the capacity to evaluate them. The person who doesn't know who they are is often someone who knows very well who other people decided they were, and has never had the experience or the permission to find out if those decisions were accurate. Here's where it gets practical. Building a genuine sense of self as an adult is possible. It is not as simple as just be yourself, because the self that is being looked for is not hidden, waiting to be revealed. It is in many cases still being built. The process looks like this. First, noticing what feels genuinely true versus what feels performed, not what you think you should want, what you actually want, not what sounds good, what feels real. Second, following curiosity without justification. Not every interest needs to be practical. Not every preference needs to be explained. The things you're drawn to when nobody is watching are data about who you actually are. Third, allowing inconsistency. The self that is genuinely yours will change, will contradict itself, will surprise you. A self that never changes isn't a self. It's a performance. And fourth, perhaps most importantly, recognizing that not knowing is not a failure. It is a starting point. The person who asks, "Who am I?" and doesn't have an answer isn't empty. They are honest. Most people fill that question with roles, titles, and external validation, and call it an identity. The person who can sit with the uncertainty of not knowing, who can hold the question without rushing to close it, is doing something far more rigorous. They're refusing to accept a borrowed self as a final one. And that refusal, uncomfortable as it is where a genuine identity begins. Not in the answer, in the willingness to keep asking. If this video describes something you've wondered about yourself, share it with someone who's wondering the same thing. And subscribe, because every week we go deeper into the behaviors, the patterns, the things about being human that nobody explains.